I had been playing at the interval Cage's, thank you. Cage's Imaginary Landscapes number 5, and that was the last of the series he did using vinyl records as an instrument, really, to generate a new kind of music. A little bit more about that in a minute. The first instance I can find of vinyl records being used as an instrument in that way is a little bit earlier, 1930. Paul Hindemith and Ernst Truck were using them in a Berlin concert in 1930, which Cage attended, interestingly. And they had assigned both vocalists and instruments to specific records, and were playing them at different speeds to vary the pitch. But Cage did not begin his Imaginary Landscape series until 1939, and Imaginary Landscapes number 5 was finished in 1952. And when I think of Imaginary Landscapes number 5 is comprised of segments from classical records. On one hand, he did 2 versions, one of classical music and one of jazz. He really didn't like jazz at all, and towards the end of his life, he was frank about being prepared to walk out of a Webern concert. He had admired Webern in his youth, but he said composers like Webern had no interest, nothing to say to him in the contemporary world. And I think, in a way, that that Imaginary Landscapes 5 is Cage's attempt to annihilate those earlier models. And it reminds me, when I hear them, of the story that Diderot wrote called Rameau's Nephew in the mid-1700s. And Rameau's Nephew, he describes the nephew of the famous composer running into this nephew in a cafe in Paris. The nephew is really furious and depressed because he's been cast out from a salon in which he was a guest. The salon basically kept him alive, fed him, and he was cast out for making an untimely joke. And I first came across this narrative in Hegel's Phenomenology, where it's set into the middle of the master-slave dialectic. And I think it's helpful to think of the master-slave dialectic sometimes as being as much an internal struggle, as much as an internal dialectic as one that's modeled on external realities. And after all, Hegel is interested in the movement, the development of consciousness, so I think it's appropriate to consider that. And in that case, this particular story of Diderot's is one of alienation, both alienation from oneself and alienation from society. So this nephew is cast out from the salon. He's stuck, penniless. He's a revolutionary in forming. He's really long before Baudelaire fought on the barricades in 1848. We have Rameau's Nephew as the prototypical anarchist revolutionary. And there's this very strange performance that he does. So quite impromptu, Hegel quotes Diderot as describing the nephew. He jumbled together 30 different airs, French, Italian, comic, tragic, in every style. Now in a baritone, he sank to the pit, then straining in falsetto, he tore to shreds the upper notes of some air, imitating the while the stance, walk, and gestures of the several characters, being in succession furious, mollified, lordly, sneering. And I think that this tearing to shreds, this treatment of, through alienation, this treatment of the music that the nephew at one time had lovingly learnt and made his living actually teaching music, is now destroying, is analogous, I think, to what Cage is doing to that, to those musical sources of jazz and classical music in Imaginary Landscapes version 5. So that's one parameter, I think, for my discussion. Another that I find helpful and enjoyable is from Hegel's logic. Science of logic. Hegel's origin myth, the oscillation between being and nothing, that starts the movement of consciousness, he describes as this: being, pure being, without any further determination. In its indeterminate immediacy, it is equal only to itself. Being, the indeterminate immediate, is in fact nothing, and neither more nor less than nothing. And he moves on to section B of nothing. Nothing, pure nothing, it is simply equality with itself, complete emptiness, absence of all determination and content, undifferentiatedness in itself. Nothing is, therefore, the same determination, or rather absence of determination, and thus altogether the same as pure being. And eventually, of course, this oscillation between being and nothing is realized by consciousness as something, and one is able to exit this seemingly interminable unsettlement. But what interests me here is to think of some of these records that I'm playing or showing you as remaining within that oscillation, as never exiting to become something. They're interested in being nothing, or they're interested in that liminality of moving from being to nothing. At least that's a proposition or a question I might ask of them. And then the third parameter, I would take from, I'm glad Brian didn't choose this in Nietzsche, but this is from Birth of Tragedy, the moment when King Midas has caught Silenus, who is keen to question about the meaning of life. Silenus is Dionysus' drunken companion, living a life of sheer pleasure and enjoyment of music. So when Midas first questions Silenus, Silenus refuses to answer. He's silent. But once tortured, he finally capitulates and says, I love this, miserable ephemeral race, children of hazard and hardship, why do you force me to say what it would be much more fruitful for you not to hear? The best of all things is something entirely outside your grasp, not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best thing for you is to die soon. And that, I feel, is an interesting framework to consider the self-annihilation of the avant-garde in some ways, the will into death. If you're born an artist, born into that profession, and you want to challenge it, you want to aggressively challenge it, you can't. You were born, you can't change that, but at least you can kill the idiom. At least you can die soon. So a couple of things I might play here, I think would be, at this point, had not Brian talked so well about it yesterday, I might play something of musique concrète, of course. But I'd like to move to something reasonably contemporary. And this is a record that New York-based artist Larry Seven and Fabio, who has a slot on WFMU, put together. And this, what's striking about this record is that it's in a sandpaper sleeve. So every time you take it out or put it back in again, it's modified. And here is side B, which is called A Smooth Finish. Put the mic back. Oh, sorry. I think it has to be side A, because a smooth finish is literally been sanded smooth. Let's try side A. So reasonable musical content, reasonable sound content for a record that's encased in sandpaper, I think you'd agree. The other record I'd like to play in relation to reasonably contemporary sounds is Chop Shop's steel plate. And I think this, I couldn't bring the steel plate, it's just too heavy, and I was concerned about what airport security would think of it. It's so heavy that if you dropped it on your foot, you'd lose a toe. So the record is normally encased in steel. And I think this is a perfect perfectly eligible for Max Newhouse's category of steel art, which I quite like the idea of steel art. But here's, there are four sides, they're fairly similar. What Scott Conselman, who is Chop Shop, does is to record ambient sounds and then process them in the studio. But sometimes he'll replay them back in the studio and re-record them, process them yet again, using the acoustic properties of the room. It's encased in a rather negative-looking black sleeve. It's basically tar paper. And inside is a booklet. He constructs speakers for each of these pieces. It's a booklet showing each of the sculptures. There's one for each side. So the one we will listen briefly to looks like that. So a very brutal sounding track, and they're all like that. It's not a modified vinyl as such, except in the way it's been treated, except in the way the packaging has affected our access to the sound, or anticipated our access to the sound. In relation to narratives around the avant-garde, I'm very interested in these, and I'm particularly keen recently on Badiou's book, The Century, and in that he discusses two aspects of negativity in relation to art practice, avant-garde practice. So there's what he calls the negative side of negativity, and here drawing on Hegel, of course. The negative side of negativity, where the artist or composer, he uses Schoenberg as an example, annihilates the idiom within which he's working. And the affirmative side, in which the artist or composer subtracts from that existing, in Schoenberg's case, range of tonal opportunities, extracts the 12-tone system, and proceeds to redefine the capacities of music in that way. And similarly, a book that's been mentioned quite a lot here, Realism, Materialism, and Art. Boris Kreuz has an essay there called Entering the Flow. And an interesting concept here is he discusses Malevich. What can survive this work of permanent destruction, as he calls it? And he says, well, the image of the destruction of the image. And I wonder if we can transpose that in some way to think of these records as providing the sound of the destruction of the sound. I find that quite functional. And in that respect, we might, thinking of modified records, we might think of Milan Nijak. I don't have any of these to play, obviously. There is a recently released vinyl version of Nijak playing these records. But in order to play something that actually has been modified in this way, I'd like to play something by Danish artists, Vinyl Terror and Horror. This is Greta Christensen and Camilla Sorensen. They're working in Berlin. And perhaps in the background, we can have this. This will show you how they use these records typically, but I'm going to try and play one here as well. So this they've constructed out of various records, quite crudely inserted and or just superimposed. They've done something similar to the cover. The record is, the music is, I think, of no consequence. And let's see what we get out of this. the other side. For a second, you have music. But those narratives of avant-gardism, let's stay here for a second. Those narratives of avant-gardism, I'm somewhat entranced by, but remain skeptical about. For me, they over-dramatize in some ways the agency of the avant-garde, and I'm more convinced or more drawn to, particularly in relation to this work, to an idea of the avant-garde in a perhaps in a more nihilistic manner, as if the negativity that the avant-garde engages in is engaged in for pure pleasure and not directed necessarily at a particular external target, so much as directed at itself inwardly, as if caught in some gyration of continuous self-differentiation or extreme otherness, so that an avant-garde becomes unrecognizable or incomprehensible even to itself. The provocation for this draws out another narrative of what I think is fairly called the fiction of the avant-garde, that of society's successful recuperation of all oppositional initiatives. It's in the avant-garde's DNA, of course, to resist this kind of recuperation. And what better way to do that than to become invisible, to become unrecognizable even to itself. If you lose yourself, it's less likely that any institution trying to absorb your radicality will locate you either. And it's in this disappearance that I find some reassurance, I think, from Paul Mann's text, Mass Criticism particularly, but also his first book, Theory, Death of the Neo-Avant-Garde. And I think after those two books he has not written anything other than on poetry, and refuses to participate in any conferences or seminars. He thinks it's a total waste of time. But in this book, talking about this category that he envisages called stupid undergrounds, I'd be wary even calling it a cultural phenomenon, but of individuals, groups that want to remain invisible, to be not even noticed as something that might be recuperated. He says this is a suicide that is not a demonstration, a gesture accompanied by notes to the other, but the most rigorous renunciation of the symbolic order. We moved from the masterpiece to avant-garde art against art, to non-art, folk, brute, etc., to the end of art, auto-destructive art, art strikes, to the most vigilant refusal, a refusal that never puts itself on display at all. And to move on now to punk and Jacques Attali. So I think Attali's book Noise has been mentioned a few times here. The category of composition that closes the book, a rather strange category, rather strange name for what we might term an oppositional form of sound or music or noise, rises up. Jacques Attali invites us to think to reverse the commodification and accumulation and the stockpiling of music. And he asks of such a radical noise that it's an activity that becomes an end in itself, that creates its own code at the same time as the work, and a negation, he says, of prescribed labor rules. He praises John Cage for returning power to a disenfranchised audience, but criticizes Cage for not enabling that audience to establish new modes of production and distribution. And I would say with these artists in the late 70s, that is exactly what they do. They produce their own records, they distribute them themselves. And Attali completely misses punk. His book came out in 1977, so that was the year punk exploded. But it's unlikely, I would say, that he would have recognized it even if it was more timely. He insisted that this music of composition be made in different instruments than those that have been used. He said he's very enthusiastic about artists like Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin, but he said if you're listening to Hendrix, you're simply participating in that cycle of commodities, or at best you're an extra in a movie about him. But in this sphere of DIY punk, I have a small selection here. So bands were putting out their own records. They were sometimes only distributed locally. And the covers are often quite eccentric. A band called Red Balloon here simply has a paper bag as a cover. The Door and the Window put out 2 singles, a simple photocopy on the inside saying how we did it, a list of all the costs of production, total cost £329.30, and quite a lot of bands were doing this, making the production process transparent. The Weird Noise EP, which has a selection of different bands on it. And what appeals to me particularly on this is one side is called Bad Side and the other is Awful Side. The tea set came out of an art school context. A lot of graphics in here, a lot of quite totally unnecessary extras like a tea bag, and very interesting posters and cover art like that. One of the weirdest records to come out at this time, I think, was by Jerry and the Holograms, who did, in fact, put out a prior record that you can play. This one can't be played at all because it's been glued into its sleeve. And they did 500 of these, all of them glued into the sleeve. I have no idea what's on it. And it's called The Emperor's New Music, which is quite appropriate. And here it says, totally unplayable. Do not play it, do not play it. There are 500 of them out there, yeah. But I'd like to play one of these. This is by a band called The Fresh. It's not strictly punk, it's post-punk, but still very much DIY. Internal labels, handmade, handwritten. I hope I have the right side here. So The Fresh is led by Chris Civey. If any of you saw that movie Frank with Michael Fassbender wearing the huge head, that was based on Chris Civey's alter ego Frank Sidebottom in the 80s, and that figure, that character, was updated to imagine what a band went down that track today might look like. But I would say if you want a successful hit single, don't do this. That is the wrong side. Try this.
God, there's a lot of dust on this music.
So a really extremely eccentric, talented songwriter, and I'd really recommend checking out some of the other records of his. I think that Christian Marclay, we can't move on without a little bit of him. So Marclay was strongly influenced by punk, and he always says that he would never have been able to do what he did without being involved in the punk scene. He was, of course, playing live, playing on stage. He'd play on stage in the 70s with a modified turntable. He could play rather like a guitar. And one record that he put out as an aftermath of an exhibition is Footsteps, which may be quite well known. We can listen to a little bit of it. Footsteps came from an exhibition where these records lined the floor of the gallery, and they were taped to the gallery floor, and the visitors could walk all over them. And at the end of the exhibition, 1,000 of these were salvaged and packaged as a multiple. It had a prior recording of Footsteps on it that had been recorded in the Clock Tower in New York. And actually, when I first came across this record, it was in a library at VCU in Richmond. And I pulled it off the shelf, always interested in Marclay, and I thought, this library can't take care of anything. It's totally fucked up. Look, it's covered in dust. Before I realized what the origin of the record was. That's it. Every 20 minutes. Okay. So footsteps. I think that the possibilities for musicians working on vinyl today are interesting to consider in the history of recorded sound. And Edison's wax cylinder was the very first recorded item. And I'm always intrigued at how, when he was trying to promote this, he took it to Scientific American to find investors. And instead of introducing it verbally, he cranked it up and had it play the following: "Good morning, how do you do? How do you like the phonograph?" And I just think in the first example of a recorded device, we have an answer to what the object wants, which is to be liked, essentially, I think. I don't have time to play these, but I'll just say how the materiality of these early records is so evident, and it's so interesting what they're constructed of. And I think this was gone over very well yesterday by another speaker in a lecture I couldn't attend. So I would just, perhaps I'll close with a question, really. It seems that to be a property of much of this kind of work, it's property of this kind of work to turn its back on interpretation in a kind of stubborn, negative, absent sound, a kind of non-sound, a sound that's so scratched or impure that it offers very little to interpretation and stays in the negative. But at the same time, if this kind of sound belongs to a subgroup of recalcitrant things, evidently it still has its own circles of appreciation and hierarchization in terms of notions of quality or interest. And is it possible then for these kinds of records to straddle two realms, the one of an absurd pointlessness and resistance, and the other of some kind of institutional validation? Or are these two realms themselves interpenetrable, themselves indistinguishable or blurred? And just to close, I'd like to finish with one final modified record, which is The Wit and Wisdom of Ronald Reagan, and which sounds like this. It's two sides of complete silence. So. All right, thank you all.
Thank you so much. I think we are a bit over time, but we have 1, 2, 3 questions.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. I had some questions around the avant-garde, and in particular, I was really excited that you brought up Paul Mann and the sort of notion of recuperation. And I think I wanted to ask a question around that might relate to the talks earlier around sort of theory and practice, and maybe sort of some problems or sort of what it might mean now after the sort of pronounced death of the avant-garde, sort of the heightened forms of professionalization that are demanded. You know, we're all sort of expected to be simultaneous theorists and practitioners. That seems to take us quite far from the sort of ultra negative and resistant kernel of the avant-garde into the sort of more financialized and again, kind of hyper-professionalized sphere of both the art and the academic
Yeah.
worlds
Yeah.
nowadays. So maybe just a sort of, like, what
Yeah.
can some of this maybe tell us about?
Yeah, it's something that's great, and it's something that Mann addresses, of course, with his image of the black-jacketed college professor going into the black nightclub and being shunned by his students who turn their back on him. Yeah, I think, but on one hand, I don't think that professionalization was absent in the period of the classic avant-garde, who obviously were incredibly agile intellectually and professionally in their manner. I think it's still incumbent on us to find, or imagine to find, or to locate. I know we're driven to it. That's, as I was trying to say, by the nature of our intellectual avarice, in a way to try to colonize ever more remote aspects of culture. But at the same time, I think it really is encouraging to, well, to stimulate, to patronize, to invest in spaces and artists that are trying to establish new configurations of practice, often on the margins with very minimal audiences. I'm very, I know because there's a certain professionalism to that too, but where it's happening in, where it's happening in, say, it's one thing if those artist-run, artist-led ventures, for example, are happening in London or New York, is a whole other thing if they're happening in some remote Midwest location. And so I think those are one possible arena for alternative discourses and alternative approaches to this question of how one might be successful, or for how long one might be successful, or what might constitute success and achievement in a particular locality. It's insane if we take, as we all seem to instinctively take the model of the high-achieving New York artist or London-based artist as a model which I think we impose too readily on our students and colleagues. And I think if one looks at that model anyway, it's often a very compromised position, I would say. I mean, having written on someone like Christopher Wool, for example, and whose paintings in his last Luring Augustine show in New York were selling for over $1 million each and had sold. As an individual to spend time with is not interesting. And so I think that one has also a responsibility to encourage young people to figure out ways to become interesting through their involvement with the world, and not to aspire to that sort of a role.
I think we should take the last question. Was it you?
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was wondering about what you said about the refusal or withdrawal of what I interpreted, and this is probably not the right words to use, as the most potent or pure form of an avant-garde, or a possibility of an avant-garde, a trajectory that could take.
Well, I think that in the narratives of the avant-garde that we inherit, say from Peter Berger, one of the better ones, Paul Mann's another one, Matai Kalinescu is quite good.
But that's also sort of been co-opted into.
Yeah, but that's one of the classic trajectories. That's Mallarmé's position. That's Baudelaire does both, doesn't he? Baudelaire becomes a militant avant-gardist. He becomes the antagonistic avant-garde, and then even in Flowers of Evil, we can see him doing both. So it's a trope one's inherited, I think, even as a practitioner. Are you thinking in terms of the present day, or in
I was
something
thinking more in terms of the present day and
else?
the way that it's some of these things becomes very difficult to see what's.
Yeah. It's interesting.
It becomes a question of authenticity almost. That's sort of weird to me when talking about.
Yeah. You also have to do what suits you. The Sandpaper record I played by Larry Severn. Larry Severn's a very interesting person to look at. He's not well known at all. He has a performance practice. He's been doing this for years and years. He's a close friend of Matthew Barney's. He's made a living taking photographs of Matthew Barney's work, but he operates very much under the radar. He's never seems to have wanted to do anything else, and yet he's greatly admired within circles in New York by people high and low. So I think there are ways, even in a place like New York, to exist through some kind of withdrawal into a realm of practice and performance that suits you. But you have to have a community. You have to establish, even so, you have to withdraw into a community in some way.
That's the strangeness about it.
Yeah.
I find that
Yeah.
it's never to the most outlying degree. It's always a degree of anonymity.
Well, if you think of someone like Laurie Parsons, it's very interesting. So Laurie Parsons, I don't remember who wrote that Art Forum essay on Slackerdom. It was in the two issues on the 80s. Laurie Parsons, when I arrived in New York in the late mid-80s, she was showing in galleries. She was quite prominent. She was bringing in detritus from the street to the gallery. And she conducted gradually a kind of disappearing act. Her career path was very clear. It was laid out in front of her. She could have done extremely well. She enacted a kind of disappearing. And I think she even had a show at the gallery she was showing at on Broadway, where the invitation went out, but or maybe the invitation didn't even go out. There was nothing that went out, and there was nothing in the gallery. She then dropped out, inverted commas, completely, and became a social worker, and has absolutely no interest in her prior career. Katie Noland, another one, no longer makes any art, was a superstar in the early 90s. Eric Oppenheim, Dennis Oppenheim's son, quite a troubled family. Christian Oppenheim, sound artist, is a daughter of Dennis Oppenheim. A very selfish father. Eric Oppenheim makes art still in Brooklyn. Brought up his son, he never shows it. He's not interested in exhibiting or re-entering into that field. And yet, when I first saw him, he was this powerhouse of an artist who was doing crazy things in and out of galleries in New York. So I think there are modes of refusal that are taken up, but you still need somehow the community and the family.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.